about the 5 pillars of dog training. And if you have these 5 things, you can pretty much teach a dog anything. So I'm just going to be going through them, going to make it kind of interactive just a little bit, and going to obviously open up to a lot of Q&A, because I think that with dog training, a lot of it is just a bunch of questions. You're like, oh, my dog does this. How can I kind of fix that? So starting to dive into the 5 pillars of dog training. So what they are is motivation, consistency, timing, clear communication, and leadership or relationship. Those 2 go hand in hand. And so I'm going to go through each of these and explain why it's really important. So for motivation, all of us kind of think of when we go to train our dogs that we grab food as a motivation reward, right? Typically when you're training them, that's the easiest way, is you just grab some food. And typically for most dogs that is going to work. But there's also toys, and then there's also physical affection and praise. So for my dogs, they obviously love food, but one of my dogs, he really loves getting affection. You could praise him all day and he's like, oh yes, I'm loving this. Mom is so happy with me. So those are the 3 different types of motivation. When it comes to each of those things, dogs are going to prefer different. So for example, chicken versus kibble. Probably going to work a little harder for chicken, right? So when you're building a relationship or trying to get your dogs to do new things, choosing those higher value rewards to learn new behaviors really expedites the process. It's just like, for you, if someone's like, hey, will you do this work? I'll pay you in rocks. And you're like, I don't really like rocks. I would prefer some cash. Works kind of the same way, right? So just kind of keeping that in mind. And then also for motivation, some impacting factors would be environment is a huge one. So for right now, with little Miss right here, it's kind of a stressful environment for her. So if I were to try and train her right now something new, then she wouldn't be super motivated, because the environment it's really impacting her. An environment, big for dogs. When I tell clients, whenever you start training, to train in a place that's familiar, there's not a lot of distractions. If you were to go out to a parking lot and they've never really hung out in a parking lot before, and you have some kibble, it's probably not going to go that great, right? So that's one of the different things. Their levels of stress, how stressed they've been in the day, impact that. And then their loading level or excitement level. So maybe they're really happy to be out in the world, but maybe just a little too happy where they can't really focus on anything. So consistency, I think, is one of the hardest parts of owning a dog, is because life gets so hectic and you just have a day where you just really need to get out the door, right? And you're like, okay, just gonna put on the leash, and then we're just gonna go outside, and then we're gonna do this, and I'm just gonna throw some food down, right? And you don't have a lot of time. But essentially, all those, if the dog hasn't learned the behavior enough, then not being consistent is like only going to the gym twice a week and expecting a 6-pack. You have to put the time and work into it. It's just like raising a child. If the child really needs to learn how to read, and you only sit down with them once a week to read with them, they're not really going to learn very fast, Or if you don't, all of the rules that you have, if you say, okay, you're not allowed up on the couch anymore, and you're really good with that for a while, but then like one day you're like, oh, you look so cute. Okay, come here. And so you let them up a couple different times. What's really unfair to dogs is that you had a rule, you got rid of the rule, and then once you decided, okay, no more dogs on the couch, and you're like, why are you up on the couch? They're like, I don't know, I was up on here yesterday and the day before. So making sure that you're super consistent in everything that you do, and not only all of these behaviors that we teach dogs, super unnatural for them, right? Like, they don't typically sit on command, they don't sleep in crates, they don't walk on a leash, they don't, eat kibble, any of these things. All of these are trained behaviors for them, and so it makes it really difficult for that to become natural. But if you have consistency, then it becomes habit. Then it becomes more natural for them. So making sure that we're always consistent, and they look to you for leadership and for guidance. So if you're not consistent, then that shows where there's a lack in leadership, and that means that they're going to want to push the boundaries more. They're going to want to see how much they can get away with, because you're inconsistent. You're like, oh, well, I was able to get up onto the couch yesterday. I bet I can get up onto the couch today. And so when you're inconsistent like that, then they're going to try and push that a lot more. Next one is going to be timing. Timing is pretty difficult when it comes to dog training. And what people don't realize is that there's a very small window where dogs can correlate their behavior and if it's good or if it's bad. And so that window is really, really small. Does anyone want to take a guess how long you have? A minute? Yeah, I mean, it's 1.3 seconds. 1.3 seconds. So, super immediate. So, when it comes to training, if you were to say sit and the dog sits, and then you say yes, it was too long, right? So that's why when it comes to training, it's really important that when you see a behavior that you like, you immediately reinforce it because you want to see that behavior more often. So it's really important to, have that timing down. And one of the different things that you can do to make sure that you're constantly, because like we just talked about motivation, is when I'm first training dogs, I always have some sort of reward for them everywhere that I go. Like, I'm sure if I reached deep into one of my pockets right now, I probably have a piece of kibble because I always have a reward on me because it's that fast. You need to say that. And what people always ask me is like, well, if I have something in my pocket, I need to get it out. How can I do that in 1.3 seconds? So that's where we move into the clear communication. So when it comes to clear communication for dogs, you have to come up with some sort of communication system, right? Dogs don't understand English. Most of the time they're tuning us out. What I'm talking about right now, she's not engaged with that because she doesn't understand it, right? So we have to come up with a communication system. And so that comes down, what we're most familiar with is marker training. Sit, yes. You do something bad, no. So the 3 different things that I teach dogs when I'm training them is yes, good, and no. So what that does is that helps bridge the gap when you have that timing. So if you're over here and I was training her and I said sit and she does it, I can't get to her in that amount of time, right? But if I have markers where she understands what a word means and that it has value to her because she knows a treat is coming. So if I say yes, that gives me the time because the yes is the verbal reward in the 1.3 seconds. That means I can say sit, she sits, I say yes, and then I can come over and I can deliver the reward. So it's a bridge to help fill that gap. And so the more that you train and the more that you build a relationship with your dog, the longer that bridge can last for, especially when you start doing like really long distance recalls and everything like that. So if they're all the way down and they're heading out in one direction and then you say sit and they sit, you got to make it over there really fast. But if you use yes, good, no, whatever it may be, the dog doesn't care what it could be. It could be rat, house, chicken, Yes, whatever it is. The words only have value because you give it value to them. So having that clear communication system for timing. For clear communication, not just having the different words and that they have meaning to them, but the different tools that you use. So one of the most powerful tools that I tell people is that a leash and a collar are some of the best tools that you can have when communicating with the dog. But only if you use them correctly, right? So a lot of the time what happens is that you're like, I have a leash and I have a collar, but my dog is just completely pulling or, whatever it may be. And that's because they're not properly placed on the dog or they're not being used correctly. And believe it or not, there's a right and a wrong way to place a collar. So if you're going out walking with your dog and they have a tendency to pull, typically it's because the collar's down really low. And what it needs to be is it needs to be up high. And when you have a leash, it's a way to communicate with them. So having tension on a leash, it creates something called opposition reflex. So if we were to have a leash, actually, we'll do this right now. So I have a leash right here. And if you were to hold this, right, and I go like this, you pull back, right? So it creates that tension. And when you have tension on the leash, there's no way to communicate with that. And so, yes, it's a constant. And so what happens is that the dog actually learns something is called learned helplessness. And so they think that, oh, this uncomfortableness of the pulling on the leash, that's just how this activity is. I accept that. It's actually what it's supposed to be. And so most of the time, if the collar's not placed up high enough, it's actually down low, it's giving the dog a lot more strength. when we work on building motivation in sport dogs, protection dogs, whatever it may be, we actually put harnesses on the dog, because that pulling, it creates frustration, and frustration creates motivation. So that's why if anyone ever has a harness on, I actually recommend that they don't have a harness on, because it's actually building motivation, because the more that they cannot get to something, the more that they want that something so bad. I'm sure that we've all seen a lab just choking itself, just like really trying hard to get somewhere, right? And they're like, you would think that the dog would stop. He's like choking himself, but there's something in that for them. And so when they feel that pull and they feel that frustration, it's building the motivation. There's a lot of chemical reactions happening in the dog. It's releasing a lot of adrenaline. It's releasing a lot of just like a bunch of chemicals that makes them feel good. And so every single time that they pull and they try to get to their motivation, but they get frustrated, is actually increasing, it's reinforcing that behavior even more. Biggest aspects of dog training that I personally don't think is talked about enough, and that's the relationship or leadership aspect. A lot of the time what happens when it comes to dog training is that the dogs are put into leadership positions. Dogs don't want to be put in leadership positions. They want all of that responsibility away from them. Dogs are better as followers than they are as leaders. So establishing yourself as the quote unquote pack leader is a great way to have your dog feel less stressed, less anxious, and it gets rid of a lot of behavior problems. People don't realize how beneficial it is to build a relationship with your dog. But what does that really mean? You know, like if I were to say, you need to work on your relationship with your dog. What that means is having structure, boundaries, and rules placed for your dog. It's kind of like a teeter-totter. You have to have a little bit of both. Just like if you're raising a kid, you got to have fun a lot of the time, but there's going to be rules and structure and boundaries as well. We have to have a balance and equilibrium. And when one of them is out of place, if there's too much affection, not enough rules, not enough structure, not enough clear communication, too much fun stuff, then that's when the poor behaviors come out and not enough of the good. Once we start implementing some more structure, more boundaries, more rules, and everything is more fair and balanced, that's when we have a more well-rounded dog. So some different ways that you can build a relationship with your dog is actually just by training them. Having that interaction with them, because if you think about the time that you spend with your dog, how much of it is actual deliberate interaction and engagement with them? Is it typically like, okay, I let you out of the crate, open the door, you go outside, you come back inside, I place your food down, I walk away, I sit down, you're at my feet. Like at no point do we have a lot of intentional interaction and actual engagement with our dogs. Even when we're out walking, it's usually them taking us on a walk, right? So it's actually not an engaged participation in between dog and the owner. There's no leadership there. So just for one, taking the time to just like train your dog and to actually have them learn new things, it not only builds confidence, which helps relieve stress and anxiety for them, it just makes them happier as well. They are very much a pack animal, and they want to have those connections with other people in their pack. And another way to build that relationship, to have yourself be seen as a leader to your dog, is to implement some rules and some structure. So one of the easy things that I tell people is to have your dog sit before they eat. A lot of dogs, they get super excited when they want to eat, their food is coming, they'll start to do a lot of demand barking, or they'll start running around or anything like that. And just simply having your dog sit. So ask them to sit, okay, good. And then you go to place the food down. And then if they get up, no. And so now they know what no means, because that was a subtle correction. You said no, they didn't get their food. Oh, okay, all right. So you ask them to sit again, and you go to place the food back down, they get up, no. And that's all that you have to do. And then before you know it, you do that I guarantee you, just like a couple different times, they'll learn really fast. So you place the food down, and then you just wait a second, and then you say, okay, or you say yes, probably yes, so that way, because that's your marker, so that way you can have that. And then you say yes, and then they can eat their food. But right there, what that's doing to them, it's not only teaching them impulse control, but it's also having them look to you for leadership. They have to check in with you and ask for permission. They say, oh, okay, is it all right for me to eat my food now? And the reason why impulse control is such a huge part of dog training is because dogs are very much in the moment. They're not thinking about what happened yesterday or 5 minutes ago. They're not worried about the future, about what's happening tomorrow in a meeting they got to go to, right? They're like, what serves me right now? Like, what can I go smell? What can I go eat? What can I go lick? You know, where can I go lay down? Whatever it may be, they're really in the moment. So they don't have a lot of self-control. I mean, I think you could talk to anyone and ask, do you think dogs have a lot of self-control? Answer would probably be no. They definitely live in the moment. So having those little things that you do, like sitting before eating, is a really great way to show that leadership, implement some structure, some rules, and then show yourself as a leader. So that way they can learn that they need to check in with you. And that means that they're engaged with you. Another thing that I really love to do is that the walk, it doesn't start when you go outside. The walk actually starts when you're inside. I think that we can all agree that we've seen a dog or we've had a dog where you get the leash out, you don't say anything to them, you just get the leash out and the tippy-tappies start. They are just so excited and they're looking at you and they start running around, you know, whatever it may be. They're just so excited. And so what happens is that, think of their excitement level on a scale of 1 to 10, right? So they were fine, they were chilling, you got the leash out, and their excitement level is like 9 or 10. They're like, oh, I can't wait to go pull on this leash. This is gonna be so fun. And so they're all the way up here. And then once you go outside, that excitement level, all it did was just increase or it stays the same. So what you wanna do is you want to have the dog check back in with you to have that loading level or the excitement level drop back down to a more manageable level. So one of the easy things that I tell clients to do is that when you put on the leash, they're gonna be super excited. That's fine, I'm excited too. We're about to go on a walk. And you just have them sit before you walk out the door and it checks them in for a second. They're like, okay, I have to control myself. I gotta sit for a second. You go to open the door and then the butt leaves the ground and you say, no, and then you just close the door. That right there, subtle correction. And they're like, I thought we were going on a walk, what's up? You know? And so you open the door again and then you just wait. And then if they start to get up, you say no, and then you just close the door. And it doesn't have to be like, no, and then you try and scare them away or you slam the door or anything like that. It's just no, and you just close the door, right? And so you open the door and you wait for them. You go through first, and then you say, okay, let's go. And then right before you know it, instead of having it, their excitement level all the way up at a 10, it's a more manageable like 3 or 4, right? And especially if you have the clear communication tools on correctly, the collar up nice and high, you have the right leash on and everything like that, and you learn to communicate with your dog through the leash, then it becomes a lot more manageable and a lot more easier to do. Exact same thing that you can do with the crate. Instead of them bolting out of the crate, just ask them to sit before they leave. And if they go to get up, no, just close the door. And that's it. So those 3 things right there, I would say, are the fastest and easiest way. Like all of those things you could probably go home and do tonight with your own dogs and just be like, oh, okay, feeding time. All right, we're gonna go for a walk and you know, you're gonna go in the crate. We can practice all these different things. It's super easy to start implementing different structure and leadership with your dog. So that's a really excellent way that I think a lot of people kind of forget, is that having rules and structure isn't being mean to your dog, it's providing them something that they instinctually need by nature. You know, when they're in a pack, they have a rank in their pack and they are held accountable to that. So they don't, you know, think of it as like if you were in an office, you know, and you're the CEO of a business, you wouldn't have an intern come in, kick their feet up on your desk, kick their shoes off, and then take their socks off or anything like that. No, of course not. No. You're the leader, and there are certain behaviors that are unacceptable. So doing those simple things, it will help your dog look to you for leadership and for guidance. So I just went over a whole bunch of information. What sorts of questions do you guys have? I have a fun exercise that we're gonna do if someone wants to join me. Yeah.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I know I saw you just post this thing about free feeding.
Yes.
That you probably shouldn't do it.
Yes.
And my dogs are like, they don't really like get super excited or worked up if I give them food.
Yeah.
And if they're hungry, they eat the food. And if
Yeah.
they're not, then they're just
Yeah.
like, okay, you give me food.
Sure,
So
yeah.
I'll just feed later.
Yeah.
So what do you do in that case?
I mean, for right there, what has pretty much happened is that they've been allowed to kind of be like a picky eater, sort of. So what I would recommend doing is that have a set feeding time. That's another way to implement some really great structure into your dog's life, is to have a set feeding time and to have a set walking time. So for me and my dogs, it's typically about the same thing every day. We get up and we go to the gym, we come back, they go for a walk, they get fed. It's the same thing day in and day out. Routine and structure is 100% one of the best things that you can do for a dog. It falls into the leadership and relationship category. So if you have a dog that is kind of grazes on food, that's all right. They're not hungry. Don't force them to eat. You just pick up the food. So and it also what it does is,
Should you give them like a set amount of time? Like if
yeah, so
you put food down, they haven't eaten in a half an hour, and then pick it back up.
no, even smaller than that. Smaller than that. So I would set the food down. So for example, for my dogs, I would set the food down and then they would eat their food, whatever it is. But if they walk away from it, then I'm like, okay, so then I pick it up and then they get that with their next meal. And that's all that I do. And what is really beneficial about that is not only will you not have an ant or rodent problem from them getting into your food and your dogs won't eat the ants or anything like that, but also it's a really great way to know if your dog is sick, because that's one of the first indicators, is that they'll usually stop eating as much, they'll stop drinking as much, they'll be more lethargic. So if you set food down and they have a set feeding time and then they don't eat their food, you're like, ooh, something's up. I should either go to the vet, switch you to a bland diet, make sure that you're, have a lot of water so you don't get dehydrated, whatever it may be. So not only that, but free feeding kills motivation. It kills food motivation, because think of it as a paycheck. If you have a paycheck all over the place, if money grew on trees and then someone came to you and was like, hey, I'll pay you $7 an hour for this. And you're like, why? There's trees all over the place. I can just go and pick money, So it kills motivation completely. And that makes training harder, which means it's hard to develop timing, consistency, all the different things.
Then like if she's at her bowl or something, she's like, there's no food in there.
Yeah.
Like, oh, let me get you some food.
Yeah. Well, it's also a really great way to regulate weight as well, because what you'll see is, she's a really young puppy. She has, the metabolism to be able to keep up with processing so much food. But as she gets older, she hits 5, 6, 7, that metabolism is going to slow down. They're not as active anymore. And then the free feeding, all of a sudden, they're going to start having joint problems, heart problems, everything like that, because they just never knew food is always available. So you don't actually know how much your dog is really eating, right? So it's super beneficial to have that structure, to have that routine. It's a great way for you to implement some leadership into life, that they need to check in with you before eating. All those different things is really important.
The other dog's food while I'm
That's another thing, is that if...
And I'm like, well, I don't know if he's eating.
Exactly. Yeah. So you don't know if he's sick or whatever's happening. She's eating more than she needs to. And then also...
I had 3 dogs at one time, and I had to stand one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Use my body to say,
yeah. 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 And what that can quickly turn into is actually food aggression really, really fast. And I've seen it happen a lot of different times. So it's really beneficial for my dogs, at least. They're always fed in their crate, because their crate is their happy place. And so I always feed my dogs in their crate. So they go into their crate, they know. When I say, it's really funny, whenever I say it to them at night or in the morning, I say, are you hungry? And then they run to their crates, and then they sit there, because they know that's what's gonna happen. I put it into their food bowls, I put it down, and then I have them wait, and I have them check in with me, and I look, and once they're looking at me, I say, okay, break, because break is their release command. And then they just go to their food. And if they don't pick it up, I'm like, oh no, are you feeling okay? What's going on? I know what's happening, and I know that they won't get into a fight because they're not going into each other's crates or into each other's food. I won't have insect problems, rodent problems, anything like that. So
we still have his 14. But I put his food down. He didn't sit his food down. The other dogs used to challenge him. Right. He would not leave the kitchen where his dish was. He'd feel like he had to guard him.
yeah.
He was starving. Rescue him. His body. So the only way to keep him relaxed is if I put his food down.
Yeah.
He didn't have to worry about protecting him.
So he didn't want it all, but he's like, I don't want
Policy 2 of nothing is free, right? You need to work for everything that you have, just like in nature. you know, it's very unnatural for carnivores, because that's what dogs are, carnivores, to have food readily available everywhere. How crazy would, huh? Exactly, right? They have to work for everything that they have. So for me, if at all possible, if I can have my dogs go outside, work with me, and be engaged, they'll be much more willing to participate with me when they're hungry. And I use their kibble a lot of the time for feeding. Dogs that I train, they don't eat out of a food bowl. Not once in the time that they're with me for a board and train. Every single meal that they eat is divided up into 4 or 5 different lessons, and then I train them, and that's how we do it. So, I mean, not saying that that's what you have to do, but it's a really good way that if you want to start getting into training, if your dog's already going to eat, why not just use their kibble, right? And also make them more motivated to eat, so you won't have a grazing problem. Yeah, make sense? Any other questions before I move on to the very last pillar? And then we'll do a fun little game. Question?
I have a problem with my dogs. I take them out in the yard, every stick you can find.
Yeah.
Try to get runs around and drop it. So acorn, everything under the sun. I constantly get him to drop it.
Yeah.
He looks around for the next thing. Constantly. Sometimes I don't get him fast, but he eats it.
Oh, he eats it, yeah.
So I'm not sure
So,
what he's eating all the time.
yes, yeah, that can be. So with something like that, making sure that you're teaching your dog the drop it command.
Stop. Drop.
Yes.
Every
And
time he does, every time he runs around.
yeah.
He's only 6 months old, but
Yes, exactly. So much energy. And in situations like that, especially for puppies, one of the things I always recommend to people, and it's gonna blow your mind because it always happens, but keep a leash on them all the time. You're going to constantly have to be redirecting. Puppies get into everything. You think they're not going to, and you're like, how did you get into that? I don't even understand. Exactly. And there's some really dangerous things, and if you can't get to your dog fast enough, so having a long line on, so like one that's like really long, like 12 feet or so, or just even a regular leash. You can go to Petco, get a regular leash. What you can do is actually cut the handle off of it so it doesn't snag on anything, burn the ends of the leash, so that way it doesn't have a handle on it to get snagged at all, and then just have them wear the leash all the time. What this really helps with is that if they get up onto furniture, you can say no, and then bring them back down, you know?
So I end up having to chase her around the...
And that becomes a fun game.
Oh,
She's like, we're playing chase. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, also teaching recall too. So having the high value food reward, right? And then whenever you call the name and she turns around, you say yes, and then you reward with the high value. So that way she correlates any time that she looks at you, good things happen. And that's what you always want for any dog, is that any time that they engage with you, then you reward them. So that way after time it becomes habit, and they're like, good things happen when I'm engaging with you.
At least been coming inside easier when
Yeah.
I call her, because now I give her a reward when she comes in.
Yeah.
So I tell her to come in, and she
Yeah.
comes in and she sits on the
Yeah.
carpet, and she's like, hey, where's my treat?
And that's with the motivation. If you don't reward your dog enough, they're not going to be motivated to do anything. So I'm always rewarding dogs, always, all the time, for anything. You know, like for behaviors, having a dog sit, it's not like it feels great for them. They don't, sit and they're like, wow,
It's magical.
that feels, guys, check this out. This feels so great right now. You have to do this more often, right? It doesn't feel great to them. Sit is the first behavior that a dog goes to, is because we've given them value. Yeah, exactly. We've given that position, that behavior value to them. Going into a down, it's not like they're like, oh, I'm just gonna lay down right here for just no reason. We give it value for them. So always be rewarding your dogs all the time, because having them being rewarded, they know that when you ask you to do something, that something's going to come along for them. There's a lot more to that varying your reward schedule so they don't become dependent on treats, which is a huge problem. So making sure that you don't do that, because that can work against you later on.
Such a catch-22, like, damn if you do, damn if you don't.
Well, what happens is that in the beginning, it's really great to reward for every behavior. They learn to interact with you, it builds motivation for them, but after a while, start increasing that threshold, right? So if you're at work and you get rewarded for everything that you do, after a point in time, your employer is gonna be like, okay, I know that you know how to clock in. I know that, now I'm going to ask you to do more. So just making sure that you vary your reward schedule. So when they sit, yes, and then reward 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. Come. Good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Good. Sit. 1. And it's like, oh, okay. Sometimes I'll get 6, sometimes I'll get 8, sometimes I'll get 12. I don't really know, So might as well just do all the time. And then increasing that threshold of sit, good, down, yes, 1, 2, 3, 4. Sit, down, come, climb, whatever it may be, and then reward. So they never know when the reward is coming. When you're first teaching a behavior, yeah, you want it to be consistent. But after a while, if they have that behavior like 8 times out of 10, start increasing that threshold of what you're expecting of them. Because if not, like the 2 Yorkies that I'm training right now, is that they're pretty much non-compliant unless you have a treat on you, which is very, very, very difficult to break. Super difficult. So just making sure that you're varying that reward schedule. And when you have that relationship, when you build that leadership and that engagement, after a point in time, like the dog stops to care about the reward. They just want to do it because they're interacting with you. You're a pack leader. You have a great relationship with them. They're like, this is fun. I just want to hang out with you. It's like going shopping for girls. It's like, whatever. You don't have to buy me anything. I just want to go hang out with you. So just doing something like that.
Is it good or bad if they come to like expect what you're gonna ask her to do? It's like I said, I start to call her inside when I ask her to sit, and then I give her a treat, and she does that.
Yeah.
And then she'll like come inside and she'll come sit on the carpet and she'll sit there before I even ask her to do anything.
No, I mean, no, not at all. I mean, what you've done is that you have just created a routine. So she's anticipating the behavior.
Okay.
That's not bad. Yeah, no, it's not bad at all, but she's expecting it. Just like if you were to do the same commands with the dog, if you're always, all right, sit down, sit again, or roll over, and you do that all the time. If you say sit, the next thing that they're gonna do is go into a down and then roll over because they know, right? So they're expecting it. Dogs are so smart. They are so, so smart. They're natural born problem solvers. So so she's just expecting it. But if she's already doing that, you don't necessarily have to reward for it because she's already doing it. So it's good. Yeah, unless you want to keep the behavior. And if you do, then vary your reward schedule where sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. Increase the threshold. If she always does those certain behaviors, start asking more of her. Whatever it may be. Maybe next it's like going into the crate or going and, doing something. Teach her to roll over. Whatever it may be. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Anything confusing so far?